Hello Unwrappers, Ollie here. Just before we begin, you'll forgive me reminding you that Christmas is just around the corner. And just for listening to this podcast, you can get a special early bird offer of a Christmas gift subscription to The Week magazine. Give someone you love a weekly digest of news, reviews and opinion lovingly selected from more than 200 UK and international sources, and you can get an extra £5 off on me. That's more than 40% off the shop price. Visit theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code EARLY for your discount. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code EARLY. And do it soon because the offer ends on the 31st of October. And now on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 24th of October and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days we've seen UK COVID-19 cases surpassing their highest ever daily figures, Emmanuel Macron promising action against extremism following the murder of a schoolteacher in Paris, and Pope Francis backing same-sex civil unions. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Joe Evans, from The Week magazine, editor Theo Tait, and so good last week we invited her straight back, freelance journalist Kieran Yates. But Theo, you are starting the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week that the United States went to war with Google?
This morning, the Department of Justice in 11 states filed an antitrust civil lawsuit against Google for unlawfully maintaining a monopoly in general search services and search advertising in violation of Section 2 of the Sherman Act.
Deputy US Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen speaking to CNBC earlier this week. Theo, what's he talking about?
They've just filed this very important lawsuit, basically accusing Google of throttling the competition in the online search market. Really, basically the main thing is with these exclusive deals that they have with partners. What they say is that Google, which was once a scrappy startup with an amazing innovative search technology, has become a monopoly gatekeeper for the internet. The basis of the case is that they pay a lot of money to people like Apple. Apparently they pay $8 billion to $12 billion every year to remain the default option on all Apple's phones, Macs, iPads, etc., all that sort of stuff.
And if you're listening to this thinking, hold on, I've got an iPhone and I had to change it from Safari to Chrome, so how is Google the default option? This is specifically about search, isn't it? So this is just about when you log on to Safari on your iPhone, the search option is Google. To most of us who use our smartphones on a daily basis, that seems like a very small thing to go to war about.
It isn't just that, actually. It's so that if you've got an Android phone, then your Android phone comes preloaded with various apps, Google Maps, Google Search, and also that if you've got a Chrome browser, that's also the default on that. That is a big question, and that, of course, is Google's go-to defense, which is that it's very easy to change it. Actually, I'm not sure I immediately know how to change my default option, in the sense that, so if you type in the top of your browser on Safari and it searches, I don't know how to change that to another one.
And be that as it may, Kieran, most users would probably want to search with Google anyway, wouldn't they? If you look at the adoption of Chrome as a browser, for example, that isn't the default option on iPhones, and yet more people use that than Safari. So obviously people are choosing Google products anyway.
I think that any kind of consumer behaviour is led by kind of seemingly trusted companies. So because Google has such, it has a monopoly, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's everywhere. So people think that it's trusted, so it's the best option. But actually, it's obviously not. And I think we've all, in lockdown, watched everything on Netflix so far. But one of the things that everybody's been watching in lockdown is the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And interestingly, one of the main takeaways from that was to change your search engine. And they recommended something called Quant, which they said is the more ethical option to Google. So it feels like this has been something that's been happening over the last few years, this idea of this historically good guy of the tech world, Google, actually revealing itself as being evil, even though that was what it was trying not to be this whole time.
But are they being anti-competitive, Joe, by paying Apple to be featured on Safari? Because that's the nub of this. Is that anti-competitive when you think that their competitors aren't the likes of Quant that Kieran was just mentioning, which are scrappy startups, but are the likes of Microsoft and Yahoo who equally could pay billions to be on Apple if they wanted to. It's a straightforward bidding war. What's anti-competitive about that?
First and foremost, of those companies you've just given examples of, Apple is by far the most valuable. It clearly is well worth Apple's time to have this kind of relationship with Google, and it's clearly well worth Google's time to have this relationship with Apple, because apparently Google's payments to Apple account for roughly 15 to 20% of their profits. So in that regard, it is anti-competitive. If Apple is buying out the market because it's the most valuable company, that's incredibly anti-competitive, and they fought very similar anti-competition cases in Europe to the one that has now been filed in the US. The difficulty really as well is that the company is a massive lobbyist in the US and spends $12 million a year lobbying Congress people in order to avoid this kind of situation. But then what is quite interesting about this is that it does reflect cross-party frustrations with big tech, because people have heard Donald Trump talk about conservative bias in social media companies and search engines like Google before. But it's also true to say that senators like Elizabeth Warren, who ran to become the Democratic candidate in the US election this year, have also called for a lot more restraint on big tech companies like Google and its own Alphabet. So I think it's fair to say that it is certainly an anti-competition issue. But it's also interesting how it's divided people who seem to have very little else in common.
Theo, the commentary that I've seen from the United States seems generally to be people saying this is politically motivated. Leaving aside Joe's point that possibly a Democratic president might do the same thing, this is coming out of Trump's DOJ because it's politically motivated, because the Republicans are angry at the big internet companies because they think they have an anti-conservative bias.
Yeah, Trump hates big tech and wants to have a go at it. The House Judiciary Committee, which is obviously made up of senators from both parties, also has reached very critical conclusions just this month. I think ultimately, whichever way you look at it, Google is a monopoly. It has, in America, 60 to 90% of the market, depending on how you calculate it. Around the world, it has 90%, apparently, which is absolutely terrifying in terms of diversity of opinion, diversity of access. If Google makes decisions on things, that affects everything so disproportionately.
What opinions are being suppressed?
Just to give an example, the Great Barrington Declaration in favour of herd immunity, the Google results on it were clearly skewed against it. Now, how exactly it reached that, I don't know, but it is just an example of whatever decision Google or its algorithm makes is very important, and it shouldn't necessarily have that kind of power.
Let's talk about that, Kieran, then, because obviously the suggestion of a suit from the DOJ is that there are some kind of dirty tricks involved. But even if there aren't, even if they've acted perfectly lawfully, even if customers are choosing Google products, does it still require breaking up? Google's parent company makes $34 billion in profit annually. That arguably just wouldn't be possible if they weren't a monopoly. So let's say they are a monopoly. So do they need to be broken up even if people like them?
Yeah, because I think that the public consensus about the amount of power that the big five tech companies have, of which Google is one of, is becoming increasingly uncomfortable, because people are aware of the abuses and corruption that can happen internally, but also how big these companies can be to fight. And so this is why this is so interesting. For me, one of the most interesting parts of the story is about public profile, because the public profile and marketing of Google over the last 10 years has really been one of ethics. And so now when we're having these conversations about monopoly, it's particularly interesting because it's actually, as consumers, we did expect better of you. You were the company that was saying, don't be evil. You were the company that was feeding into Hillary's campaign. I know 90% of Google employees, their political donations went to the Democrats. They were seen as this alternative tech company that were doing what we wanted the others to do. Now they're pushing back against these ideas of monopoly, and we're in a new phase, I think, on our relationship with big tech. I think that we want to see that broken up so we can say, actually, we do want parity and diversity, and we don't want so much huge conglomerate power in one of five places.
But given to who, Joe? Okay, let's say that actually, and this will never happen in the United States, will it? But let's say that they said, you can't own YouTube anymore. Who gets to run it? Time Warner. Why is that better?
This is one of the problems as well. And that kind of attitude, I'm not sure I have a convincing answer to that question, really, because nobody really knows. And the Justice Department hasn't really put forward any remedies in its lawsuit as to what to do about this kind of antitrust issue. But that attitude is part of the problem. I mentioned this to a friend of mine yesterday, that the US Justice Department had filed a legal suit against Google, and he said, what am I meant to do? Use Ask Jeeves? Which I think answers the question to a degree, doesn't it? It answers the question about what should be done, because consumers don't feel like there is anything that can be done. But it also speaks to the issue with the competition, that it's so inconceivable to think of any company supplanting Google as the sort of go-to search engine that it's very difficult, I think, to argue from that position that there isn't a competition problem. The problem is going to be really that the Justice Department has to prove that Google is dominant in the search market and also that they're deliberately hobbling competition.
But is that a problem? That's the bit, Theo, that it seems to me they think they'll win. And that's apparently, as I understand it, the reason they've pursued search rather than search advertising at this point is they can easily prove Google is the dominant force there. Do you think they will win?
I think they can. The issue is that they've got to prove some kind of consumer harm, and that is more difficult. What's quite interesting is that their case is that it limits the market. For instance, it stifles innovation, reduces choice, and diminishes the quality of search services, including as regards data privacy, which is quite interesting that basically you're stuck with Google, which, as we know, is zero data privacy.
By default, we should say, if Google were here, they'd say you can look into the information they hold on you and you can choose what they keep and what they don't. But
Sure.
You're right that the majority of the public don't do that.
But the point is, if you have this massive company that makes all the money out of it, it gets to be the best, it gets to be much better than the other, you only have one choice about data, etc. As a journalist, I always use Google because I think it's probably the best. So I would quite like to have another reliable choice that wasn't Google. And I don't think in the current situation, if it isn't broken up, then that will ever happen.
OK, without Googling it, Kieran, what do you think is the likely outcome of this case?
Oh, I have absolutely no idea. I feel like it would be very optimistic to assume that Google won't kind of circumvent the legal loopholes of this and break up. I think that it will probably remain intact, but that's not a hopeful takeaway, is it?
They'll probably be able to be told to knock it off with Apple and not pay them so much money. I think the broader thing is that with these massive tech monopolies, they've got to be taken on, and they've got to be taken on in America, because the European competition people have been going at Google for many years, and it doesn't really do that much. And the Americans say, you're just jealous. It's got to happen in America. We know that America does have these great big monopolies that build up, but also it has a great tradition of antitrust busting. They're going to be the people who are going to break it up. So I think in the long run, that's a positive development.
All right. Joe, you're up next after this. OK, Joe, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the week the EU finally said no to gold-plated citizenship schemes?
Today, as you have seen, the European Commission is launching infringement procedures against Cyprus and Malta by issuing letters of formal notice regarding their investor citizenship schemes, also referred to as golden passports. The Commission considers that the granting of citizenship for predetermined payments or investments without any genuine link with the member state concerned undermines the essence of EU citizenship.
EU Commission spokesperson Christian Wiegand earlier this week. Joe, what's the story?
So Cyprus and Malta have been told by the European Union that they are going to face penalties if they don't abandon the schemes that they both have for selling what are called golden passports to foreigners. It's not the most surprising news in the world because it's actually long anticipated that the EU would want to crack down on these schemes. Basically, it's been suggested for a long time by both the EU and anti-corruption NGOs that the programmes are essentially a great opportunity for people to launder money or change their identity and also flee the law in the country that they actually come from.
OK, so it may not have come as a surprise to you, Joe, but for those of us who have not been following the story, have never heard of a golden passport, and it sounds like something out of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, what are they?
So essentially, they are a way of gaining a route to citizenship by investing a huge amount of money in a country. So to give you a quick rundown, Cyprus essentially went bankrupt in 2013 and also launched a golden passport scheme in 2013, weirdly enough. It's since issued 4,000 of the passports and it's raised about $8 billion. You can essentially get yourself a Cypriot passport in exchange for €2 million of investment in the country, and it's normally in the real estate sector. And there's very little oversight of the process and there's minimal additional requirements to get hold of one of these passports.
And why shouldn't someone who invests £2 million in the estate of a country be entitled to live there if they want?
So, in essence, that isn't a problem. Lots of countries in the European Union have them. 20 out of 27 of the EU's member states have paths to residence for foreign investors. The issue is that in the example of both Malta and Cyprus, they have been evidenced on a string of occasions to be linked to corruption and also to be allowing people that have broken the law, essentially, in their home country to gain access to the European Union to either flee justice or to set up similarly criminal endeavours on the continent.
Yes, and Kieran, that's an interesting element to this story, isn't it? With the European Union, when you're talking about asylum seekers, it very often comes up in tabloid coverage that if they are able to claim asylum in one country in the EU, then technically they can move to any country in the European Union. But when it comes to millionaires, that isn't really discussed. But it's exactly the same problem, isn't it? Cyprus wants the money. Cyprus gives them a passport. But then that person is an EU citizen with the right to live anywhere in the EU, even if they've got a criminal record elsewhere.
Yeah, the obvious discomfort of a story like this is the huge disparity, isn't it? We live in a world where there are these huge financial disparities. And if even anybody who's only learning about golden passports now, of course, it's been a conversation for a couple of years, but anybody who had only heard about this today, their immediate thought would be, okay, isn't this a potential for lots of corruption? Isn't there a potential to circumvent lots of the systems that you would usually have to go when you're seeking citizenship? And the answer is yes. And the result, of course, is yes. Like you were just saying there, what we saw in Cyprus, I think, was like a particular big case that Al Jazeera reported on, where people who had purchased these golden passports were like, some were serving prison sentences, some were like was like under international sanctions, all these kinds of things. And you think, yeah, that to me is an obvious way that this system can be abused. It has been overlooked because these aren't people who are conflict refugees or migrating over borders for economic reasons. And so the national conversation hasn't been demonizing these people to the extent that probably it should be. Not that I'm saying the refugees should be demonized, but I'm just saying that we are not holding them to the same account. And so I was quite pleased to see this story gaining some traction last week.
Yeah, and Theo, the Al Jazeera story that Kieran's referring to there was, it's an old-fashioned sting, basically, wasn't it? Actually, these criminals, these money laundering criminals, were fictional people, and they were in the style of a sort of fake shake story from the News of the World days, setting up the Cypriots to say, will you give them a passport or not? And they fell for it. And then immediately they backtracked and they said, we're not going to do golden passports anymore. But it shouldn't have taken something like that for them to take this action. It was an obvious hole in the logic of what they were offering, wasn't it? Nothing's changed just because they can show it's possible.
Yeah, I think the fact is that these schemes exist all around the world. It's not as if in Britain we haven't had our problems with this as well. I like the fact it was Gordon Brown who introduced our one, the Tier 1 investor visa. Nowadays, if you invest 2 million or more, you can come to the UK. But we've had real problems with dodgy Russian money, highlighted in a parliamentary report earlier this year. So I don't think we're particularly on the moral high ground. I guess the thing is, it does all come down to due diligence, doesn't it? And if you do it carefully. Personally, to me, it's distasteful that you can buy citizenship anywhere. But I can see that there are great advantages. Otherwise, Gordon Brown wouldn't have done it. And I guess you've just got to do it more carefully than people do now.
And what's extraordinary about some of these schemes, looking into it, Joe, is it's not even a case of you can buy citizenship by investing in the country, but you don't even have to live there. In the case of St. Lucia, they are touting around a scheme where people just effectively openly give money to the St. Lucian government, and then they get to be a St. Lucian citizen with a visa that lets them into all sorts of other countries, and they don't have to step foot in the place.
No, quite right. And that's one of the things that the European Union is taking issue with here, is that one of their problems is that it's not in keeping with European Union values to have people buy citizenship that don't ever actually live there or don't have any massive link to the country. The problem being that they've now asked Cyprus and Malta, first of all, they've both suspended their scheme, but what they've asked them to do is sort of promise to reform their scheme or scrap them entirely. It's very difficult to imagine that's going to happen when you look at the sort of situation on the ground in both countries. To take Malta as an example, it is a fabulously corrupt country. Their Prime Minister resigned in January this year, having had his Chief of Staff and his tourism minister named in the Panama Papers. His Chief of Staff was then linked to the murder of a freelance journalist. It doesn't hugely fill you with confidence that they're going to root out the problems with due diligence in these situations. And yes, there's been a changing of the guard to an extent in Malta, but then again, with a track record like that, it doesn't hugely fill you with confidence. Then you look at Cyprus, who this year had to strip 26 people of passports that they'd handed out to them that they'd just granted. I don't know, it doesn't massively fill you with confidence. And as Theo says, it's completely right to point out that London and the City of London is a laundromat for foreign money as well.
Yeah, and on that sort of moral high ground point, Kieran, that Theo was making, it's easy for us to say, oh, look, they'll give a passport to anybody as an individual. How corrupt, this person's evidently a criminal and they're giving them a passport. But when it comes to dealing with nations that are involved with corrupt or criminal behaviour. We do it all the time. We have infrastructure that's paid for by China. We sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. And the argument given to the British people in those cases is, well, it's worth it for the nation's coffers. We turn a blind eye to that stuff. We raise it, but we don't let it get in the way.
But we shouldn't do that. The fact is that we do that, but we shouldn't do that. But you do raise a good point about some of the ethical questions and how knotty it becomes. Because when I first learned about this story, it was via St. Kitts. And at the time when I was learning about it, because part of the relationship was putting $150,000 into hurricane relief funds. And so I was like, oh, maybe this feels like it's the most ethical way of doing this. And then under further interrogation, you learn that maybe that still isn't the best thing. But I think every country actually is different, and every country, the way that they're investing in certain specific things is different. So we also can't look at a story like this and just have a blanket position on where money is going, or the assumption that all the money is corrupt. Now, that's not to say that this is still an ethical way to assume citizenship somewhere, but I think you do have to take a case-by-case study on where money is going specifically and what the long-term impact is of that. But yeah, I'm really interested to see what happens next, really.
And Theo, countries like Cyprus, that's the point, isn't it? They do need the money from somewhere. If they're not getting enough of a subsidy from the EU to subsist to the level that they want, they have to look at options like this. And we covered a few weeks ago remote working visas, which is EU countries wooing foreigners to come and work there. And we were saying, oh, that could be the future, couldn't it? Remote working, you can be anywhere. Why not contribute to the economy? And that was something middle-class earners could afford to do. You needed to have a steady job. Is this so different? You know, this is a way of getting the next tier, isn't it?
Governments raise money in all sorts of different ways. I just don't think that's any reason for having systems that are obviously so problematic. And I mean, I think part of the problem really is kind of a design fault with the European Union. If you can get your money into any European jurisdiction, then it can go anywhere in Europe. So you see it in a lot of these smaller jurisdictions that don't have decent due diligence and compliance. You've seen it in Estonia, with banks in Estonia and Cyprus, Bulgaria a bit as well. And then once it's there, it could be anywhere in Europe. It puts a lot of pressure on these less well-run countries. I'm not surprised that they do it.
The point Theo raises about it being a design issue with the European Union is a very good one. And it's a case that has been made. Journalists have been making the case that the Maltese golden passport system is corrupt for years and years. They voiced their kind of incredulity at the fact that the European Union has now suggested that because of one Al Jazeera sting, it's a new problem. I think that this kind of plays into a wider point, and the reason I think it has implications is because the rule of law element of the European Union is coming under a lot of strain at the moment. They've just had a huge dispute over whether or not they should pay out coronavirus relief funds to countries that don't maintain democratic norms, specifically Hungary and Poland. And essentially the major European powers have flexed and allowed them to have access to coronavirus relief funds despite the kind of slow deterioration of the civil society and democratic norms in both of those countries. And this is just yet another example of the fact that actually the European Union is quite slow on the uptake when it comes to upholding kind of legality across the bloc. The reason it has implications is because if the European Union is going to talk about European values and is going to be hugely beneficial to thousands of people in so many ways, it needs to get real about actually how well it enforces those values and how well it upholds law across the bloc.
So hold on, get real. So is this a positive first step along that journey, or is this not enough? What do you mean by get real?
I think it's a very positive step. I think it's a very real attempt to combat what is essentially organised crime. And that's a very positive step. It'll be interesting to watch how it develops, and it'll be interesting to see whether Malta and Cyprus end up reforming their programmes, scrapping them, or whether they just get slapped with a financial sanction and then carry on.
Kieran, you're up next after this. Okay, Kieran, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the week COVID-19 took a holiday?
The first coronavirus case was detected late last year at one of Wuhan's largest meat and seafood markets, and authorities moved swiftly to lock the city down. After 76 days, the lockdown was lifted, and many people emerged from their homes for the first time. But a fresh outbreak of cases about a month later forced authorities to roll out a mass testing plan for the city's 11 million people. They achieved it in about 10 days. Since then, the city hasn't reported any locally transmitted cases.
A video by Sharon Shee for the Wall Street Journal. Kieran, an underreported COVID story. Who knew?
I love this story because if we're talking about implications for a future world, this is it really. The story is about Wuhan having the highest number of visitors of any Chinese cities at 18.8 million tourists over Golden Week. So Golden Week is a Chinese national holiday. It's usually 7 or 8 days. And this is referring to the week from the 1st to the 7th of October. And the point of Golden Week historically is to expand domestic tourism and kind of raise morale, raise the standard of living. And it does seem to have boosted tourism to this like monumental extent. And so people are coming from mainland China, obviously, because they can't go out. So usually lots of people during Golden Week would leave China. For obvious reasons, they can't do that. And one of the places that they're coming to is Wuhan.
And is this growth happening organically? Or are they being persuaded by the government to go and visit Wuhan to help Wuhan because they've had a difficult year?
Yes. So some of the main tourist attractions are the Yellow Crane Tower, the Happy Valley Amusement Park, Wuhan University, and they have waived their fees for a lot of these places. So people are getting free entry. There's lots of stuff with hotels where people, are getting much discounted hotel stays than they would have done. I don't know why buffet has become such a central story of the coronavirus epidemic, but they're inviting people to have buffets for I think a third of the amount that it would cost staying for breakfast. There's lots of things basically where they're encouraging tourism. But why I think it's particularly interesting is the psychology of seeing this, which is one of the things that has come out of this story for some of the tourists, which is where they say that they see Wuhan as one of the safest places to go. Because, of course, it's the ground zero place, and the way in which they have seemingly tackled the virus means that they're safe in that place.
That part of the story, Theo, goes beyond Wuhan, doesn't it? Because it's actually worth looking at the statistics for Golden Week across China as a whole. 637 million people travelled around China for Golden Week this year. Admittedly, those figures are from the Chinese Ministry of Culture and Tourism, but let's assume that's roughly right. And 2 weeks on, again, according to official figures, China's still only averaging 20 new cases of coronavirus a day. So it seems to the world that China is doing something right. What is that?
I think it really helps to be a dictatorship. But also, lots of dictatorships are very badly run, and let's hand it to China. They're pretty well run in lots of ways. I think it's absolutely extraordinary they've managed to squash the virus in this way. And obviously, Dido Harding and Test and Trace could learn a lot from what's going on over there. To be honest, the actual details of how they've done it, they've got their amazing test and trace system, which everyone does all the time. They've imposed very strict lockdown rules whenever it breaks out. Beyond that, I don't really know why. I think they've done amazingly.
I guess, Joe, as Theo was suggesting there, it's essentially that Chinese have no choice but to obey the system. That's very different in the United States, for example, which is a federal system where they're almost encouraged to rebel against the national policy.
Yeah, funnily enough, I've just finished a big piece for the Week website today on whether or not stripping Downing Street of some of its decision-making powers and being a more regional or federalised political system would have helped the UK respond better to the virus. And the thing with the Chinese response is that its incredibly centralised political system means that it was incredibly lethargic in terms of responding to the pandemic in the early weeks and months, because there's very little incentive for local officials to take responsibility for things, and also it takes a very long time to transmit information back to the central hub in Beijing. What it also means, however, is that because it's an incredibly centralised political system and, as Theo rightly says, a dictatorship, it's able to take incredibly strong measures that you just wouldn't be able to get away with carrying out in most Western countries. Chinese state media has credited the country's traffic light health code system, for example, with kind of quashing the virus. But what that does is synchronise a citizen's ID with their travel history, which means that essentially you'd be able to find out where they've been at any given point. Now, obviously, that wouldn't fly in Britain. You can barely get people to download a track and trace app unless they're absolutely convinced that their data is safe. And it should also be said it has a centralised epidemic response system. And most Chinese adults are old enough to remember the SARS epidemic, and so they were ready to respond in a way that Western countries that have never dealt with similar things just weren't really.
But it's just interesting looking at the visuals, Kieran, in that video that we just played the clip from the Wall Street Journal. They have some footage of that theme park you were talking about, Happy Valley, and the people queuing for the rides are rammed up next to each other like they would be at Disneyland or Alton Towers pre-pandemic, and certainly aren't now in Western theme parks. People are standing next to each other with absolutely no distance whatsoever because they've all been tested, they're all wearing masks, and the government knows where they are. Yes, they've obviously lost some of the freedoms that we have, but they are liberated to behave like normal tourists in a theme park without having to think about the virus whilst they're there.
And I guess this is reflected in the data that came out last week about the Chinese economy growing by 4.9% in the third quarter of 2020, which has also given way to lots of conspiracy theories about how China must have been instrumental in spreading this virus to boom their own economy, which I do not agree with. But I think that it's an interesting point to make, and I think we have to be careful not to valorize the Chinese response too much, because of course we know in those early weeks the response was slow. There is still a lot of criticism internally. As you say, these statistics come from the Chinese tourism authorities. And the data, when you really look into it, is still quite questionable. The official death toll of Wuhan is 3,869, which seems extraordinarily low for a city of that size. And I think there is this kind of sense that some of this data must have been manipulated. I don't know how high the trust is, but what we can see is that you're right. From these images, it appears that people feel safe. It feels like people are going back to business as usual. One of the things that I've been most fascinated by is that in the actual Wuhan market, where the ground floor was the original wet market was, on the second floor, there was an eyeglass shop called Eyeglass City, which has been well reported. And that is now open for business as usual. Not that it's getting huge amounts of footfall, but it is open. People are visiting there. And I think that this usually would probably become some kind of ground zero memorial ground in the way that you might see other places historically when we talk about dark tourism. But actually it hasn't. People really are just spending in retail. They're spending on infrastructure. They're spending on amusement parks. They're not going to valorize the dark tourism of the wet market.
But maybe that's because we're still in the midst of the pandemic now, globally. Joe, we've talked about this on the show before, this phenomenon of dark tourism, and you were discussing visiting Chernobyl. Do you think, actually, if you fast forward a few years' time, let's hope that this is behind us in some sense, Wuhan, that wet market, will be a tourist site for that kind of thing? People will be interested to see the epicenter where it began.
I can't necessarily see it personally. I can't see the Chinese Communist Party valorising the site of something which has actually been quite nationally embarrassing in the way that we might set up a memorial to people that were lost in a terror attack or something in the West.
But isn't Chernobyl a good example? I mean, that was pretty nationally embarrassing, and yet it is a tourist site now.
Yeah, but it's not a memorial, is it? It's left like that because there was nothing that could be done, because you can't go there for any length of time. I'm not sure that the Soviet Union, which is a state that was built on similar levels of sort of national pride and a belief that they were charting a course that was distant or different from the West, would have necessarily memorialised a screw-up like Chernobyl.
But you're looking at that from the Chinese point of view. Theo, what I'm saying is, as a Western tourist in a few years' time, I realise this isn't Kieran's story, but I just think it's interesting, you'd be more likely to visit, wouldn't you? You've heard of Wuhan now.
Yeah, I'd be interested to visit Wuhan. And I probably would be interested to visit the wet market. I don't think there are going to be nice plaques there.
Kieran, some people think that dark tourism can be healing for a city.
I think there's an obvious human fascination because I guess the psychological argument is that we can learn from the mistakes by visibly seeing devastation. So where there has been human error, perhaps we can really apply better processes. And so I don't know how much I think that people would not go to Wuhan wet market. I think actually they probably would. But I think what's interesting is that some of the reports that came out from the people who were still working and living by the market is that they think that the most likely outcome for the site is that it's going to be demolished and some high-rise flats will be built there or something like that, something relatively innocuous, and time will try to erase that in the way that Hitler's bunker has been covered over by a car park, that kind of thing.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you for the story, and big thanks to all three of you for joining me, Kieran, Theo and Joe, and thank you for listening to this edition of The Week Unwrapped. If you want a holiday from 2020, we've been covering oddball news like this all year, and our entire back catalogue is available now. Just search for The Week Unwrapped using your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.